In April of 1841, Silas Rutled made an announcement that froze even the cruelest hearts in South Carolina. He declared before the county's finest that his only daughter, Catherine, would no longer be under his authority, but that of one of his enslaved men, Ezekiel Cross. Not as punishment, not as a caretaker, but as her complete master. The whispers that followed that day spread like wildfire through Colleton County. Even the men who had built their lives on human suffering found it unthinkable. A white woman, the daughter of a plantation owner, turned over to a man they saw as property. They couldn't imagine that behind the scandal was a secret, darker than any rumor, a debt written in blood, and a vengeance that would consume them all. Spring in Colleton County was heavy and thick, the kind of heat that felt alive. The Comb River moved like black glass through the swamps, carrying the reflection of trees dripping with Spanish moss that swayed like ghostly shrouds. Cypress Grove Plantation sat there in stillness, 800 acres of green decay. The hum of insects and the rhythm of tools striking mud were the only sounds that broke the silence. It was a world where cruelty passed for order and where men like Silas built their fortunes on backs bent under the sun. Silas Rutled was a man trapped by ambition. He had money, but not enough to join the inner circle of the county's power brokers. He owned 58 enslaved people, enough for comfort but not prestige. His late wife, Elizabeth, had been the practical one. After her death giving birth to Catherine, Silas's need for recognition turned to obsession. He gambled, he borrowed. He made deals with men who demanded more than repayment, they demanded allegiance. By the time his hair turned grey, he was drowning in debt and pride. Catherine Rutled grew up in a house where affection was currency no one could afford. Tutors replaced friends, walls replaced the world. Her weight, her illnesses, and the medicines prescribed by well-paid doctors made her a ghost inside her own body. When she was 12, she witnessed something in the cellar, a sight that shattered her forever. From that night on, her fits began. She screamed about blood and chanting, about men in masks who fed the land with death. Her father called her sick. The county called her mad. None of them wanted to believe what she had seen. Then came the letter sealed in red wax, the scythe crossed with wheat. The mark of the brethren of the harvest. They were 13 men, landowners and judges, who gathered in secret to offer blood to what they called the hunger beneath the soil. The letter demanded payment of $12,000. Silas had nothing left to sell but his soul, and the brethren gave him an alternative. He would show his loyalty through sacrifice, place his daughter under the full control of one of his enslaved men for an entire year. Her body, her dignity, her life, his to give away. In return, his debt would vanish, and his standing would rise once more. That night, Silas sat by candlelight, staring at the flame. He thought of the ridicule he'd face, the ruin of his family's name. Then he thought of the brethren's reach, their connections to every judge, every banker, every sheriff. They could erase him with a word. By dawn, he had written his acceptance. Hands trembling, he sealed his daughter's fate to preserve his own. 3 days later, a wagon creaked into the yard of Cypress Grove. Inside sat Ezekiel Cross, 33 years old, a tall man with eyes too calm for the times he lived in. He had been bought in Virginia, quiet and obedient, the letter claimed. But when Silas stepped onto the porch, Ezekiel looked up and met his gaze directly, steady, unflinching. It was not the stare of a beaten man. It was the look of someone who had already seen hell and walked out of it alive. That evening, the county's finest gathered to witness the medical transfer of Catherine Rutled. The air buzzed with discomfort and morbid fascination. Catherine stood trembling beside her father, pale as wax, while Silas announced that she would now answer only to Ezekiel. He will oversee her behavior and discipline. He will have full authority. The silence that followed was colder than the river's depths. Men stared. Women whispered. Ezekiel said nothing. When the ceremony ended, he simply nodded once, and Catherine was led away to the quarters behind the main house. For weeks, the house was filled with echoes. Catherine's screams pierced the nights. Servants crossed themselves and whispered prayers. But then, the screams stopped. A month passed, and when Catherine emerged again, she was changed. Her steps were steady, her eyes sharp. The servants said she walked beside Ezekiel like an equal, not a captive. Her father called it improvement. The brethren called it proof of obedience. But neither saw what was truly forming between them. Ezekiel Cross had not always been a slave. His mind carried knowledge, herbal medicine, carpentry, languages whispered across continents. His wife and child had been taken years ago, victims of one of the brethren's harvest rituals. When he arrived at Cypress Grove, he recognized the symbol carved on Silas's letter. He knew what the brethren were, and he waited. Under his guidance, Catherine learned truth what her father had done, the meaning of the gatherings in the cellar, the lives taken to feed the land. Rage replaced fear. The woman they called hysterical became a witness, sharpening her will to strike back. By late summer, strange accidents began. One brethren member drowned in the flooded rice fields. Another suffocated in his sleep. A third was found hanging from a tree, his eyes wide with terror. Silas grew restless, pacing the halls at night. Catherine watched him, silent. Ezekiel moved like a shadow, his calm now edged with purpose. On the first night of November, a storm rolled over Colleton County. Thunder swallowed the sky. Silas summoned the brethren to the plantation for what he called a cleansing. 13 men gathered beneath the house, torches flickering against brick walls. They prepared the altar, but the blood spilled that night wasn't of the enslaved, it was their own. Catherine appeared first, holding her father's ledger. Ezekiel followed, his hands coated in oil. The doors locked from the outside. Flames spread through the tunnels. Their screams mixed with the storm's roar. By morning, Cypress Grove was nothing but blackened bones. When the fire died, 2 figures stood at its edge. Catherine clutched the journal, its pages filled with names, rituals, debts paid in blood. Ezekiel said softly, "Go north. The fire will cover your trail. Find those who can help you." She nodded. "And you?" she asked. He looked toward the ashes. "I have more work to do. There are still chains to break." They parted. At dawn, 2 ghosts stepping into different worlds. History recorded a tragedy. 13 men lost to fire, their meeting gone horribly wrong. Silas Rutled, the mad daughter, presumed dead in her locked room. Ezekiel Cross, sold to Alabama and never seen again. The county mourned its nobleman. Funerals filled the churches. The truth turned to smoke. But whispers survived. Stories of the plantation, where the masters burned. Of a woman and a man who defied every law written by cruelty. Of a hidden journal buried in the ruins. When Union troops passed through the area 2 decades later, they found tunnels under the soil and bones in the swamp, but war left no time for ghosts. In 1971, construction workers found a sealed leather book inside a wall, written in code, names, and dates inside. Before it could be studied, it vanished. Some say descendants of the brethren stole it. Others claim it still waits, buried beneath the old oaks, a truth too dangerous for polite history. What is known is this: power built on suffering cannot last. The fire at Cypress Grove burned more than wood and flesh. It burned the illusion that cruelty is eternal. Sometimes, the powerless find their power not in weapons, but in memory, in witness, in refusing to forget. Somewhere, perhaps still hidden in the South's humid soil, Catherine's journal waits for a hand brave enough to open it, to finally tell the story of the enslaved man and the woman who turned their prison into a reckoning. Do you think that journal still exists, waiting for someone to read what the fire tried to erase? The ruins of Cypress Grove smoldered for days. Smoke drifted across the rice fields like a mourning veil, and ash fell onto the water where enslaved men still worked, silent, pretending not to see. The county sheriff arrived with 6 men, found 13 charred bodies, and declared the matter closed. The newspapers called it an unfortunate accident during a gathering of gentlemen. But the slaves whispered the truth. Ezekiel Cross had walked into the fire and come out alive. 2 days after the blaze, a rider from Charleston reached Colleton County with news of an escaped woman seen traveling north, dressed in rags but carrying a leather book pressed to her chest. No one stopped her. No one dared. They said her face was pale as the moon, her eyes burning with something unholy. Catherine Rutled was dead in name, but alive in legend. She rode through back roads and forests, crossing creeks where the water ran red from the clay. In every town, she traded something small, a ring, a ribbon for bread. She spoke little, but when night came, she opened the journal and read the words her father had written. The rituals, the oaths, the names of families who had fed the brethren for generations. Every page was a confession carved in ink and madness. She promised herself one thing, that the truth would not die in those ashes. Ezekiel, meanwhile, vanished into the wild. He found shelter among the swamps where the cypress roots rose like bones. He built a small cabin with his own hands, tended herbs that could heal wounds and poison, and waited. He was hunted, but he knew the woods better than any man born free. The people who found him first were not bounty hunters, they were the hidden ones. Escaped men and women moving through the dark, guided by the whisper of the underground. Ezekiel became one of their protectors, leading them north. Some called him the healer, others the ghost of Cypress. But those who had seen what he'd done in that fire knew better. He was vengeance wrapped in calm. Winter came early that year. The first snow fell on Catherine as she reached Virginia. Her body was weak, but her spirit sharpened with every mile. At a church safe house, she met a preacher who offered her a new name and passage north on a wagon train. She hesitated. She had a message to deliver first. That night, she wrote letters, copies of the ledger's most damning pages, and sent them to Charleston, Savannah, and Washington. Within months, 3 plantations burned. Their owners disappeared. The Brethren's power began to rot from within. Years passed. Catherine made it to Philadelphia under the name Clara Nash. She worked as a nurse, treating those who had fled slavery through the same routes Ezekiel helped create. Her hair turned gray, but her eyes never lost that quiet fire. Sometimes she dreamed of the river, of the smoke, of the man who told her to run. She never saw Ezekiel again, but sometimes, at dawn, she swore she heard his voice in the church hymns. In 1865, when the war ended, a man appeared at her door. He was thin, older, his hands scarred. He carried no papers, no weapons, just a small box carved from cypress wood. He didn't speak until she looked at him closely. Then, in a whisper, "Catherine." Her breath caught. They didn't embrace. They didn't need to. Time had turned their pain into something sacred. He opened the box. Inside lay the remnants of the journal, burned edges, but legible words. "It survived," he said. "You were right. Fire can't kill the truth." Together, they spent weeks rewriting every page, this time in their own hands. The Brethren's crimes, their rituals, their names. When the last word was inked, Ezekiel said, "We'll hide it again." But this time, not for them, for the future. They sealed it in wax and buried it beneath a church floorboard, marking the spot with a carving, a scythe, broken in half. Ezekiel stayed for one more season. They worked side by side, tending to the wounded and feeding the hungry. But the years had taken their toll. One evening, as the sun bled over the rooftops, he told her, "You must live on for both of us. Tell them we were never ghosts. Tell them we were real." When Catherine woke the next morning, he was gone. She found his old wooden cross necklace tied to the gate. She lived another 20 years, long enough to see freedom written into law but not yet into hearts. When she died, the church bells tolled 13 times. Some said it was coincidence. Others said it was the Brethren's final echo, an acknowledgement of the debt they could never repay. A century later, in 1971, construction workers found a sealed wall behind the ruins of an old church near Philadelphia. Inside was a box carved from cypress, wrapped in oilcloth, its contents water-stained but intact. A broken scythe symbol marked the lid. Historians called it a myth. The box disappeared before it could reach the archives. No one knows who took it. But sometimes, when the river fog drifts low over the land where Cypress Grove once stood, locals say they see two figures in the mist, a tall man and a woman in white, standing side by side, watching the fields that once fed on blood. Because some stories refuse to die. Some truths wait in silence until the world is ready to face them. And somewhere, maybe under the roots of an ancient tree or beneath a forgotten church floor, Catherine's journal still lies in the dark, whispering its warning. Power built on cruelty will always fall, and the fire of the powerless will always rise again.